The official account of this shocking story begins with a simple observation from a man who knew the forest better than any map. A lumberjack in the dense, rain-soaked woods of coastal Oregon was preparing to cut down a tree with a strange bulge, and what he found inside made him scream, not with terror, but with a sudden chilling recognition that the natural world had been violated. For over 40 years, Silas Croft's life had been governed by the predictable cycles of the Siuslaw National Forest, a realm of perpetual twilight beneath the canopy of ancient Douglas firs. His existence was measured in the clean scent of sap, the groan of falling timber, and the profound, almost sacred silence that defined his workspace. The forest was a place of immutable laws, and he was one of its few trusted stewards. On that overcast morning in October of 1986, the air hung heavy with the smell of damp earth and decaying leaves, a familiar perfume that usually brought a sense of peace. Croft moved with the slow, deliberate economy of a man whose body was shaped by decades of hard labor. He was marking trees for the next season's cut, his axe leaving small, precise wounds in the bark of giants that had stood since before the state of Oregon was founded. He worked alone, his only companions the distant cawing of crows and the soft, percussive drip of moisture falling from ferns and moss-laden branches. The solitude was not a burden, but a necessary condition for his craft, allowing him to listen to the language of the wood. It was near a forgotten creek bed, in a section of the forest rarely visited, that he encountered the anomaly. The Douglas fir was immense, well over 200 feet tall, its trunk thick and gnarled with age. But halfway up its length, a massive asymmetrical growth protruded from the bark, a hardened tumor of wood that disrupted the tree's natural columnar ascent. It was not a burl, which he had seen countless times, but something more deliberate, more foreign. The texture was wrong, the shape too uniform in its deformity, as if the tree had been forced to heal around a deep internal wound that did not belong to the forest. This was a hidden story waiting to be told. He approached cautiously, running a calloused hand over the rough surface of the bulge. It felt dense, unnaturally so, lacking the subtle give of living wood. He had seen trees scarred by lightning, disease, and the claws of bears, but this was different. This felt like a secret the tree had been ordered to keep. Lifting his marking axe, a tool he knew as well as his own hand, he tapped the surface of the growth. He expected the familiar, resonant thud of solid timber. Instead, the sound that returned was a dull, deadened clink, a metallic echo that had no place inside a living thing. The sound was a desecration, a note of discord in the ancient symphony of the woods. The metallic ring vibrated through the handle of the axe and up his arm, a cold signal of profound wrongness. Silas had spent a lifetime learning the forest's secrets, but this was a language he did not understand. He stepped back, his eyes scanning the surrounding woods, the silence suddenly feeling less like peace and more like a watchful presence. The trees around him seemed to lean in, their ancient forms standing as silent witnesses to his discovery. He knew then that this tree had to come down. Whatever it held inside, it was a secret that had festered in the heart of the woods for too long, a splinter of another world lodged in the flesh of his own. He looked up at the sky, a sliver of grey visible through the dense canopy. The air grew colder, and the crows that had been a distant chorus fell silent, as if in anticipation. The decision to fell the tree was not one of profit, but of necessity. It was an act of lancing a wound, of exposing a sickness that had been hidden from sight for generations. This was no longer just another day's work. It had become a confrontation with a mystery buried not in the earth, but suspended halfway to the sky, locked away inside a wooden sentinel. This discovered story was only just beginning its slow, dark ascent into the light. The weight of the moment settled upon him, a feeling as heavy as the damp air. In all his years, the forest had been a place of honesty, its dangers known and its patterns reliable. But the dead metallic sound from the heart of that ancient fir introduced a new element: deceit. The tree had been made a liar, forced to conceal a truth that was not its own. Silas knew, with an instinct born of the wild, that what he was about to uncover was not a natural curiosity but a remnant of a human secret, one that had been deliberately and unnaturally buried where no one was ever meant to find it. For a moment, he considered walking away, leaving the anomaly to its silent vigil. But the metallic echo was a question that demanded an answer. The forest, he knew, was a place of life and decay, of wood and soil, not of cold, unyielding metal. To ignore it would be to accept a corruption at the heart of his world. He took a deep breath, the scent of pine and wet moss filling his lungs, and reached for his felling saw. The silence of the woods felt like a held breath, waiting for the first cut that would begin to unravel this unbelievable story. This single dissonant sound marked the end of Silas Croft's ordinary life, and the beginning of a historical investigation that would pull a quiet academic into a forgotten chapter of the Cold War. The forest had kept its secret well, but the steady rhythm of a lumberjack's work had finally, after decades of silence, knocked on a hidden door. The scream that would be attributed to him was not of fear, but of the shock of revelation, the sound a man makes when the world he thought he knew is irrevocably broken. If this story already has you hooked, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss the unbelievable discoveries we uncover next. The felling of the ancient Douglas fir was an act of careful, calculated destruction. Silas Croft worked for hours, the roar of his chainsaw the only sound in the vast, silent cathedral of the woods. He made his cuts with precision, guiding the tree's fall away from the tangled undergrowth of the creek bed. When the final cut was made, a deep groan echoed through the forest, a sound of dying majesty. The giant shuddered, hesitated for a long moment against the grey sky, and then fell with a deafening crash that sent birds scattering for miles. The impact shook the very ground, a seismic event that marked the end of a centuries-long life. The tree did not land cleanly. The immense weight, combined with the structural weakness caused by the internal object, caused the trunk to fracture upon impact. It did not snap, but rather split open lengthwise near the bulge, the wood tearing apart with a sound like a thunderclap. A long, dark wound was ripped through the center of the log, exposing its core to the daylight for the first time in generations. It was a violent, unnatural break, revealing a cavity that was not the product of rot or disease. The wood inside was stained a dark chemical black, and from the fissure, a faint sterile odor like ozone and rust seeped into the damp forest air. Cautiously, Croft approached the fallen giant, the smell growing stronger as he drew near. He peered into the splintered chasm in the trunk. There, nestled in a bed of hardened, blackened pulp, lay a metal cylinder. It was roughly 2 feet long and 8 inches in diameter, its surface a dull, leaden grey that seemed to absorb the weak light. The object was deformed, dented and scarred as if from a great impact long ago, before the tree had begun its slow work of concealment. Remnants of what looked like rotted leather straps and canvas were fused to its surface, suggesting it had once been part of a larger assembly. This was no random piece of junk. It was a carefully constructed container. He ran a gloved hand over the cold, pitted surface. The metal was heavy, far denser than steel, and felt unnaturally cold, as if it retained a chill from some deep, forgotten place. Stamped into the metal, faint but still legible, were markings. He could make out the words, "Danger, do not open," in English, and below them the same warning repeated in the stark angular letters of the Russian Cyrillic alphabet, "Opasno ne odkravat." On a small metal plate riveted to one end, a single cryptic phrase was visible through the corrosion, "Project Hemlock." The bilingual warnings spoke of a history far removed from this isolated Oregon forest, a relic of a global conflict hidden in the heart of the wilderness. This was not a smuggler's cache or a lost treasure. The warnings and the lead-like density of the container pointed to something far more sinister, something meant to be shielded from the world. Silas felt a deep instinctual unease, the kind of fear that wild animals feel in the presence of an unnatural predator. He had stumbled upon something that was never meant to be found, a piece of a dangerous, forgotten history that the tree itself had tried to swallow and erase. The forest had been made a tomb, and he had just performed an unwitting exhumation. This was not just a mysterious discovery, it was evidence of a trespass. He used the tip of his axe to pry the object from its wooden prison. It came free with a sucking sound, the surrounding wood fibers having grown into its every crevice over the decades. It landed on the damp soil with a heavy, solid thud, a sound that seemed to absorb the silence around it. The cylinder was a stark alien object against the soft greens and browns of the forest floor. It radiated a sense of profound wrongness, a man-made scar on the face of the natural world. This was the source of the metallic echo, the secret the tree had held for so long. He stood over it for a long time, the chainsaw idling at his feet, the silence of the woods pressing in on him. He thought of the old stories told by his grandfather, tales of strange lights in the sky and military convoys that used the logging roads at night during the tense years of the 1950s. They had always been dismissed as local folklore, the ramblings of old men. But now, with this impossible object at his feet, those forgotten tales took on a new and terrifying weight. This was more than just a found object, it was a confirmation of a secret history. The air grew colder as the afternoon light began to fade. Croft knew he could not leave the cylinder here. To rebury it would be to become complicit in the secret it held. To report it to the local authorities felt futile. What could a small-town sheriff do with a relic of a forgotten Cold War project? His decision was born of a simple, pragmatic logic. He knew of only one person who might understand the significance of such a find, a man who collected forgotten stories and was not afraid to challenge the official narrative of the past. With immense effort, he hauled the heavy cylinder onto the bed of his pickup truck, covering it with a dirty tarp. As he drove away, the forest seemed to watch him go, the wound in the great fallen tree a dark, accusing eye. The sterile, chemical smell clung to his clothes, a scent that did not belong to the woods. He had entered the forest that morning as a lumberjack, a simple man of the trees. He was leaving as the custodian of a dangerous secret, driving toward the city, toward a quiet university office where this unbelievable discovery would begin its second, more dangerous life. Silas Croft's journey ended at the Portland State University History Department, a quiet, labyrinthine building that smelled of old paper and floor wax. He found the office of Dr. Alistair Finch, a man whose reputation preceded him. Finch was a historian of the American West, but his true passion lay in the shadows of the official record, the unwritten histories of military installations, abandoned government projects, and the environmental consequences of the Cold War. His office was a testament to his obsession, a cramped space overflowing with declassified documents, topographical maps, and forgotten government reports. It was less an office and more an archive of institutional secrets. Finch listened to Croft's story with a quiet, unnerving intensity, his eyes fixed on the lumberjack's weathered face. He showed no surprise, only a deep, scholarly focus, as if Croft were a living document, providing a new piece of a puzzle he had been working on for years. When Croft finished, Finch walked with him to the parking lot and pulled back the tarp. He stared at the leaden cylinder for a full minute, his expression unreadable. He recognized the bilingual warnings and the style of the container immediately. It was a standard-issue disposal capsule from the Atomic Energy Commission, used in the 1950s for the containment of hazardous materials. After securing the capsule in a locked storage area in the university's geology department, Finch's investigation began not with the object itself, but with the place it was found. His first stop was the Clatsop County Records Office, a repository of mundane documents that occasionally held extraordinary secrets. He spent days poring over old forestry surveys, land use permits, and logging contracts from the 1950s. He was looking for a discrepancy, a blank spot on the map, a moment in time when the official narrative wavered. He knew that government secrets were often hidden not in classified vaults, but in the deliberate omissions of public records. This hidden story would have left a paper trail, however faint. He found it in a U.S. Forest Service survey from the spring of 1953. The document, typed on brittle yellowed paper, detailed a temporary land use restriction for a 5-square-mile area within the Cieslaw National Forest, the exact location where Croft had felled the tree. The official reason given for the closure was a sudden and severe outbreak of a pine fungus blight, a type of aggressive fungal infection that threatened the region's timber industry. The report recommended a complete quarantine of the area, prohibiting all logging and public access for an indefinite period. It was a plausible, almost boring explanation for closing off a section of the woods. However, a subsequent document filed in the fall of 1955 lifted the quarantine. The follow-up report stated that the blight had been successfully eradicated through targeted environmental treatments and that the area was once again safe for public use. The entire event, from the discovery of the devastating blight to its complete elimination, had taken less than 30 months. To Finch, who had studied the history of forest pathology, this timeline was not just improbable, it was impossible. Eradicating such a blight would have taken the better part of a decade, and the process would have left a massive, visible scar on the landscape, a dead zone of felled and burned trees. There were no such records of a massive logging or burning operation. There were no follow-up studies, no articles in scientific journals, no mention of the Clatsop blight in any subsequent forestry literature. The event had appeared in the official record with bureaucratic suddenness and had vanished just as quickly, leaving no ecological trace. It was a ghost in the archives, a perfectly constructed lie designed to look like a routine environmental crisis. The story of the fungus was a cover, a piece of administrative camouflage for something else entirely. The real story was far from a simple blight. Finch cross-referenced the dates of the quarantine with military activity logs from the nearby Camp Rilia. He found nothing. The operation, whatever it was, had been conducted off the books, using the civilian authority of the Forest Service as a shield. The name on the capsule, Project Hemlock, appeared in none of the declassified indexes of military or AEC projects from that era. It was a ghost project, one that had been so effectively erased that it had not even left a classified file behind. This was the work of professionals in the art of institutional forgetting. He returned to his office, the 2 forestry reports laid out on his desk. The contradiction was stark and undeniable. On one hand, there was a physical artifact, a hazardous material container from a secret project. On the other, there was a mundane official record of a non-existent fungal outbreak. The gap between these two realities was where the truth lay buried. The forest had not been sick, it had been used. It had been turned into an open-air laboratory for a project so secret that its existence had to be scrubbed from history using the most mundane of lies. The investigation was no longer about a single anomalous object. It was now about deconstructing a carefully crafted fiction that had held for over 30 years. Finch knew he was standing at the edge of a historical void, a place where the official narrative had been deliberately severed from reality. The pine fungus blight of 1953 was the lock on a hidden door, and the capsule found by Silas Croft was the key. He now had to turn it and face whatever lay waiting in the darkness on the other side. This was not just a mystery story, it was an act of historical resurrection. The next phase of the investigation took place in a secure laboratory in the university's sub-basement, a sterile, windowless room designed for handling geological core samples. Dr. Finch, with the help of a trusted colleague from the physics department, prepared to open the capsule. They worked with extreme caution, wearing protective gear and using remote handling tools. The air in the room was cold and still, the only sound the low hum of the ventilation system. The capsule sat under a bright clinical light, its cryptic warnings a stark reminder of the potential danger it held. This was a moment of truth, where the physical evidence would finally speak. After hours of carefully grinding through the corroded seal, the lid of the cylinder came loose. There was no hiss of escaping gas, only a release of the same faint, sterile odor that had emanated from the tree. Inside, cushioned by a brittle, rubberized foam that had degraded into a fine black powder, lay the contents. They were not what Finch had expected. There was no weapon, no device, but something far more valuable to a historian: a record. The main item was a leather-bound scientific logbook, its pages warped and stained by moisture, but miraculously preserved by a wax paper wrapping. Alongside it were a dozen glass slides containing soil samples and a small pocket-sized Geiger counter, its needle frozen at the far right of the dial. Finch carefully carried the logbook to a containment hood and began to turn the delicate, yellowed pages. The entries were written in a precise scientific hand, the ink faded but still legible. The dates ran from July to August of 1953. The author of the logbook never used his name, referring to himself only as the field observer. The book was a meticulous record of Project Hemlock, and it contained no mention of any pine fungus blight. Instead, the entries detailed a series of experiments involving the atmospheric release of a specific radioisotope, a man-made element Finch had never heard of, designed to be untraceable by standard detection methods of the era. The logbook described a secret field test. The goal of Project Hemlock was to study the environmental uptake and persistence of this new radioactive particle. The scientists had intentionally contaminated a controlled section of the forest, the 5-square-mile quarantine zone, and were tracking how the radiation moved through the ecosystem. There were chillingly detached descriptions of measuring isotope levels in the soil, the water of the creek, the pine needles, and even in captured insects and small mammals. The forest had not been the site of a natural blight. It had been a laboratory for a radiological experiment. This creepy story was now one of cold, calculated contamination. The contradiction with the official record was absolute and horrifying. The US government had not been fighting a plague. It had been creating one. The logbook revealed the environmental treatments mentioned in the 1955 report for what they were: a hasty, incomplete cleanup operation. The entries described the use of chemical sprays designed to bond with the radioactive particles and flush them deeper into the soil, away from the surface where they might be detected. It was not an act of decontamination, but of concealment, a deliberate burying of evidence. The Geiger counter, though broken, was a powerful piece of corroborating evidence. Its needle was stuck in the maximum danger position, indicating that at the moment it had stopped working, it had been exposed to a level of radiation far beyond what was considered safe. It was a silent testament to the intensity of the contamination within the project zone. The soil samples, when analyzed by Finch's colleague, confirmed the presence of decaying isotopic residues that matched the cryptic chemical formulas in the logbook. The physical evidence was irrefutable. The real story was not just a cover-up, but a story of a deliberate secret poisoning of American soil. The most disturbing discovery came on the final page of the logbook. The last entry, dated August 28, 1953, was written in a hurried, panicked scrawl that was a stark contrast to the neat script of the preceding pages. It read, "Containment failure at Site B. Dispersal exceeds projections by a factor of 10. Wind shift pushing plume south. Protocol abandoned. Capsule must be discarded. We are pulling out. May God forgive us." The entry was a confession of a disaster, an admission that the secret experiment had gone terribly wrong. The scientists had lost control of their creation. Finch leaned back from the microscope, the words from the logbook echoing in his mind. The capsule had not been carefully buried. It had been discarded in haste by men fleeing a catastrophe of their own making. A tree had been used as a makeshift disposal unit for the evidence of their failure. The story was no longer just about a secret experiment, but about an unacknowledged radiological accident. The lie about the pine fungus had been invented not just to hide the project, but to hide a disaster. The quiet, sterile laboratory suddenly felt like a tomb. The air seemed thick with the weight of the 30-year-old secret. Finch now understood that he was not just dealing with a historical lie, but with a present-day danger. If the cleanup had been as hasty as the logbook suggested, then the 5-square-mile quarantine zone was not a historical footnote, but a still active contamination site. The forest itself was the last silent witness to the crime, and the proof was now in his hands. This was a shocking discovery that transformed an academic exercise into a matter of public safety. The burden of the discovery fell upon the shoulders of one man, Dr. Alistair Finch. At 58, he was a man who existed out of time, more comfortable in the dusty silence of archives than in the company of his peers. His academic career had been one of quiet rebellion. His doctoral thesis, a scathing critique of the environmental legacy of the Manhattan Project, had earned him both a reputation for meticulous research and the permanent suspicion of the university's administration. They saw him as a liability, a man whose work courted controversy and threatened to disturb the comfortable relationship between academia and government funding. This untold mystery story was the kind of thing he had been searching for his entire life. Finch was not a crusader in the traditional sense. He was not driven by ideology, but by a profound, almost obsessive need for an honest historical record. He believed that history, as it was officially written, was a monument to power, built upon a foundation of convenient omissions and sanctioned lies. His life's work was to excavate that foundation, to find the cracks and contradictions where the real stories lay buried. The Project Hemlock capsule was, for him, the discovery of a lifetime, a perfect, self-contained universe of historical deceit, complete with a physical artifact, a secret record, and an official cover story. His methods were those of a patient detective. He worked in solitude, trusting few and documenting everything. He treated historical evidence with the reverence of a forensic scientist, understanding that the faintest trace, an altered date on a document, a missing entry in a logbook, a name redacted from a report, could be the key to unlocking a hidden narrative. He was a man who listened to the whispers of the dead, to the voices that had been deliberately silenced by the machinery of the state. In the story of Project Hemlock, he had found a choir of such voices. The other key figure in the initial phase of the discovery, Silas Croft, retreated from the narrative almost as quickly as he had entered it. After delivering the capsule to Finch, the lumberjack returned to his solitary life in the forests of Clatsop County. He was a man of the physical world, of wood and steel and soil. The world of secret projects, radiation, and government conspiracies was an abstraction he had no desire to engage with. He had found the anomaly and passed it on, fulfilling what he saw as his duty to the forest. He had lanced the wound, now it was up to someone else to heal it. When later approached by Finch for a formal testimony, Croft politely refused. His statement, recorded in Finch's private notes, was simple and direct. "The forest has a long memory. I gave you what it spit out. That's the end of my part in it." He was the catalyst, the unwilling oracle who had unearthed the relic but refused to interpret the prophecy. His role was complete. He served as a crucial witness to the object's provenance, anchoring the entire investigation in the tangible reality of a man, a tree, and a place. Without him, the capsule could have been dismissed as a hoax. With him, it was an undeniable fact. This left Dr. Finch in a position of profound isolation. He possessed a truth with monumental implications, but he had no institutional backing and only one reluctant, reclusive witness. The university wanted him to stop. The local authorities had already dismissed the initial inquiry. He was a lone scholar against a 30-year-old secret, a secret that had been created by an organization with limitless resources and an absolute commitment to its own invisibility. His only allies were his own reputation for integrity and the undeniable weight of the evidence itself. He knew that to bring this story to light, he would need more than the capsule and the logbook. He would need to find corroborating evidence, human stories that existed outside the official documents. He needed to find the other victims of Project Hemlock, the ones who had not been recorded in any logbook. His investigation would have to move beyond the archives and into the realm of memory, into the quiet, forgotten corners of the local communities that bordered the poisoned forest. Finch's profile was that of the classic outsider, the Cassandra figure who sees the coming danger but is disbelieved by those in power. His marginalization was both his greatest weakness and his greatest strength. It meant he had no resources, but it also meant he had nothing left to lose. He was not afraid of institutional disapproval. He had lived with it his entire career. He was the perfect investigator for a secret like Project Hemlock, because he was a man who had already dedicated his life to believing the unbelievable. The stage was set for a confrontation not of physical force, but of competing historical narratives. On one side was the immense silent power of a government that had erased its own crimes. On the other was a single, determined historian, armed with a few scattered pieces of a 30-year-old puzzle. The weight of the secret was now entirely on Finch's shoulders, and he knew that the next steps he took would determine whether the story of Project Hemlock would be brought into the light or be buried again, this time forever. This was his emotional story, a battle for the soul of history itself. Armed with the logbook and the analysis of the soil samples, Dr. Finch made a formal attempt to bring his findings to the attention of the authorities. His first and only official meeting was with the sheriff of Clatsop County, a man named Brody who had held the office for 20 years and viewed the world through a lens of pragmatic simplicity. The meeting took place in the sheriff's cluttered, wood-paneled office, a room that felt more like a fishing lodge than a center of law enforcement. The air was thick with the smell of stale coffee and pine sol, a scent of stubborn, small-town bureaucracy. Finch laid out his evidence with academic precision. The capsule, the translated Russian warnings, the logbook entries, the radiation readings from the broken Geiger counter, and the soil analysis. He explained the contradiction with the official pine fungus story and pointed to the logbook's final, panicked entry as evidence of an unacknowledged radiological accident. He spoke of a potential ongoing public health risk, of a section of the forest that could still be dangerously contaminated. He presented it not as a historical curiosity, but as an active threat. Sheriff Brody listened with a look of weary patience, his chin resting on his hand. When Finch had finished, the sheriff leaned back in his squeaking chair and let out a long sigh. He did not examine the evidence. He did not question the scientific analysis. He simply dismissed it all with a wave of his hand. "Professor," he said, his voice laced with a condescending familiarity, "the Army and the AEC used these woods for all sorts of things back in the 50s. They left junk all over the place. Old munitions, vehicle parts, God knows what else. What you've got here is a piece of forgotten trash, a found object." The sheriff's rationalization was a masterpiece of institutional inertia. He framed the discovery as a mundane anomaly, the kind of thing that wasn't worth the paperwork it would generate. The warnings in Russian? Propaganda, he suggested. They were trying to scare the Soviets, make them think we had things we didn't. The logbook? Could be a fake. Could be a training exercise that never happened. The radiation? The whole world was full of radiation back then from all the bomb tests. Every piece of evidence Finch presented was met with a simple, dismissive explanation designed to close the inquiry before it could begin. Finch pressed the point about the missing hikers from the newspaper articles he had found, suggesting a connection to the accident described in the logbook. The sheriff chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "People go missing in these woods all the time, Professor. It's a big, wild country. They get lost, they fall, they get taken by a cougar. You can't go connecting every old missing persons case to some creepy story about a secret government project. That's how you end up sounding like a crank." The dismissal was total. The official mind was closed. The second wall of denial came from Finch's own institution. The head of the history department, a cautious administrator named Dr. Albright, summoned Finch to a meeting. Albright had seen Finch's request for university resources to fund a full-scale field investigation. The request was denied. Albright explained that the university could not officially sanction research based on unverifiable materials of questionable provenance. He called the capsule anecdotal evidence and warned Finch that pursuing this line of inquiry could jeopardize the department's federal grants. The message was clear. The institution would not protect him. This rationalization was more subtle than the sheriff's, but far more insidious. It was the denial of the academic establishment which cloaked its fear of controversy in the language of scholarly rigor. By questioning the provenance of the artifact, the university was creating a bureaucratic escape hatch. It was suggesting that without a clear official chain of custody, the capsule was nothing more than a historical curiosity, unfit for serious academic study. They were using the rules of the system to discredit a discovery that threatened the system itself. Finch was now completely isolated. The law had refused to investigate, and the Academy had refused to sanction his research. Both institutions had, in their own way, advised him to forget what he had found. They were not actively conspiring to hide the truth. Their denial was more passive, a systemic defense mechanism designed to maintain the status quo and avoid uncomfortable questions. They were treating the story of Project Hemlock as a minor anomaly, a piece of historical static that was best ignored. He left the meeting with Dr. Albright with a heavy sense of foreboding. He had seen this before. It was the same pattern of institutional denial that had buried the stories of industrial poisoning and nuclear contamination for decades. The first response was never to investigate, but to rationalize, to minimize, to reframe the extraordinary as the mundane. It was a form of intellectual cowardice, a collective agreement to not look too closely at the darkness that lay just beneath the surface of the official narrative. But the denials had the opposite of their intended effect. The casual dismissals of the sheriff and the bureaucratic warnings of his department had only strengthened Finch's resolve. Their resistance was, in its own way, a form of confirmation. It told him that the secret of Project Hemlock was still alive, still powerful enough to make men in positions of authority deeply uncomfortable. He knew then that he would have to continue his investigation alone, outside the official channels, in the shadows where the truth was still waiting. The attempts to rationalize the discovery had failed. They had only proven how dangerous it truly was. Forced into the shadows of his own investigation, Dr. Finch turned to the only resource he had left, the small, forgotten archives of the communities that surrounded the Siuslaw National Forest. He knew that if Project Hemlock had been a disaster, it would have left echoes in the lives of the local people, faint traces of sickness and loss that would not have appeared in any official government report. He was no longer looking for a smoking gun, but for a pattern of quiet suffering, a collective wound that had never been explained. He was searching for the human cost of the secret. His search began in the archives of the local newspaper, the Astoria Herald. He spent weeks scrolling through microfiche, his eyes straining against the flickering, ghostly text. He cross-referenced the names of the missing hikers from 1953 with property records and census data, trying to build a picture of who they were. They were not tourists. They were local men, loggers and hunters who knew the woods intimately. The official explanation that they had simply gotten lost seemed increasingly unlikely. These men were not the type to wander off a trail. The real breakthrough came not from the stories of the missing, but from the obituaries. Finch began a morbid, painstaking process of tracking the death records of people who lived in the small towns and logging camps downwind from the Project Hemlock quarantine zone. He focused on the years between 1955 and 1965, the decade immediately following the experiment. He was looking for anomalies, for clusters of diseases that should not have been there. It was a search for ghosts in the data, a project that felt more like epidemiology than history. He found the pattern in the records of a small, now-defunct community clinic in the town of Seaside. The clinic's meticulous records had been donated to the County Historical Society, where they sat unexamined in dusty cardboard boxes. In these records, Finch discovered a startling spike in rare forms of cancer, leukemia, thyroid cancer, and bone cancer, among the local population beginning in the late 1950s. The victims were often loggers, fishermen and farmers, people who worked outdoors, people whose lives were intimately connected to the land and the water. One file in particular caught his eye. It was the medical record of a local doctor, a man named William Madsen, who had run the seaside clinic in the 1950s. Dr. Madsen had kept a private journal, which had been donated along with his official records. In the journal, Madsen expressed his growing alarm and confusion over the wave of mysterious illnesses he was treating. He described symptoms that were consistent with radiation sickness, severe anemia, hair loss, skin burns that would not heal, and a host of aggressive cancers. Madsen's journal was a harrowing first-hand account of a medical mystery. He wrote of his frustration with the state health department, which dismissed his concerns as a statistical anomaly. He documented his own private investigation, noting that many of his sickest patients had worked or hunted near the quarantined section of the national forest. He even described treating 2 loggers who, in 1954, had developed horrific skin lesions and sickness after they had, on a dare, snuck into the restricted zone to hunt for deer. Both men were dead within a year. This was no longer just a ranger story or a farmer story. It was a chronicle of a poisoned community. The doctor's journal was the corroborating evidence Finch had been searching for. It was an independent, expert testimony from a man who had no knowledge of Project Hemlock but had meticulously documented its consequences. The journal was a voice from the grave, a cry of alarm that had been ignored for 30 years. It transformed the story from one of a secret government experiment to one of a silent man-made plague unleashed upon an unsuspecting population. Finch cross-referenced the names of Dr. Madsen's patients with the obituaries and death certificates. The numbers were staggering. In a community of just a few hundred people, there had been over a dozen deaths from these rare cancers in a single decade. It was a cancer cluster of horrific proportions, one that had been written off as a tragic coincidence. The accumulation of evidence was now undeniable. The logbook, the newspaper articles, the medical records, and the private journal all pointed to the same horrifying conclusion. He now had a story that could not be dismissed as a fantasy or a conspiracy theory. It was a narrative supported by multiple independent sources, a story of scientific hubris, institutional failure, and human tragedy. The secret of Project Hemlock had not been a clean one. It had bled out into the surrounding communities, leaving a legacy of sickness and death that had been deliberately ignored. The evidence was no longer just a collection of documents, it was a mosaic of lost lives. The weight of this knowledge was immense, and Finch knew that what he did next would determine if those lives would be forgotten forever. As Dr. Finch's investigation deepened, the story began to escape the confines of his dusty office and seep into the community. He started cautiously reaching out to the surviving family members of the people Dr. Madsen had treated, a delicate process of reopening old wounds. He was met with a mixture of suspicion, grief, and a surprising amount of guarded confirmation. Many of the older residents of the area remembered the strange period of the pine blight, the military presence, and the subsequent wave of sickness that had swept through their small towns. The story, which had been a collection of disconnected rumors and private griefs, began to coalesce into a shared, suppressed history. An elderly woman whose father, a logger, had died of leukemia in 1958, told Finch that her father had always sworn he'd seen men in white suits like spacemen working in the woods at night near the quarantine zone. A retired fisherman recalled a massive fish die-off in the local river in the mid-1950s, an event that had been blamed on a chemical spill from a paper mill but had never been fully explained. This was the hidden story bubbling to the surface. This slow accumulation of anecdotal evidence began to create a fracture within the community. When Finch presented his preliminary findings to the Clatsop County Historical Society, hoping to gain allies, the reaction was deeply divided. The board, composed largely of established conservative community leaders, reacted with alarm. They accused Finch of sensationalizing the past and dredging up old tragedies that were best left buried. They feared that a story of a government cover-up and radiological contamination would tarnish the reputation of the region and harm the tourism and fishing industries. The president of the society, a wealthy timber executive whose family had logged the area for generations, publicly denounced Finch's work as a dangerous fiction. He argued that the illnesses were tragic but unrelated, and that Finch was simply trying to make a name for himself by spinning a wild tale. This faction of the community represented the powerful instinct to protect the sanitized official version of local history. They were the guardians of the public memory, and they saw Finch as a threat to the comfortable narrative they had constructed. However, a younger generation of historical society members, along with the descendants of the victims, rallied to Finch's side. They saw his investigation not as an attack on their community, but as an effort to finally give a name to the unexplained suffering that had haunted their families for decades. They formed a small informal group dedicated to helping Finch gather more evidence, searching their own family attics for old letters, photographs, and diaries that might shed light on the events of the 1950s. This was a battle for the soul of the town's history. The fracture became public when the local newspaper, the Astoria Herald, published a cautious, carefully worded article about Dr. Finch's research. The article did not mention radiation or a government cover-up, but it spoke of a historical inquiry into a mysterious cluster of illnesses from the 1950s. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The newspaper's office was flooded with phone calls. Some were from angry residents accusing the paper of fear-mongering. Others were from people who wanted to share their own stories, their own memories of unexplained sickness, of loved ones who had died too young. The institutional fracture was mirrored by a social one. Families who had lived side by side for generations found themselves on opposite sides of the issue. The debate played out in the local diner, the post office, and the church hall. Was Finch a truth seeker or a troublemaker? Was this a genuine mystery story or a dangerous conspiracy theory? The town was being forced to confront a past that it had collectively agreed to forget, and the process was painful and divisive. The most significant development came in the form of a single anonymous phone call. The call was to Finch's university office, a woman's voice, elderly and trembling. She did not give her name, but she told him that her father had been one of the lead scientists on Project Hemlock. She said that he had lived the rest of his life in a state of profound guilt and paranoia, terrified that the truth of what they had done in that forest would be discovered. He had suffered from nightmares and had spoken of a terrible mistake they had been forced to bury. Before hanging up, the woman's voice dropped to a whisper. "They were supposed to retrieve all the test capsules," she said, her voice cracking with emotion. "But the accident, it was too chaotic. They left some behind. They never found them all. My father always said, the real danger wasn't what they released, but what they left buried in the ground." The call was a bombshell, a confirmation from a source inside the project itself. It meant that Croft's discovery was not unique. There were other toxic secrets still sleeping in the heart of the forest. The story of this abandoned place was far from over. The anonymous phone call galvanized Dr. Finch. The confirmation that other capsules might still be in the forest transformed his investigation from a historical reconstruction into an urgent, present-day search. The whispered words of the scientist's daughter provided him with a new, terrifying focus. He was no longer just documenting a past tragedy. He was trying to prevent a future one. He knew he had to return to the quarantine zone, to the place the logbook had ominously referred to as Site B. This was a buried story that needed to be literally unearthed. He could not go through official channels. The sheriff was hostile, and the university had forbidden him from using its resources. So he assembled a small clandestine team. It consisted of himself, David Chen, a former graduate student who was now a geologist with expertise in ground-penetrating radar, and Silas Croft, who, despite his reluctance, agreed to guide them back to the exact area where the tree had stood, his knowledge of the forest's hidden trails being indispensable. They planned their expedition in secret, like a team of explorers preparing to enter a lost world. They entered the quarantine zone at dawn on a cold, misty morning. The forest here felt different, older and more menacing than the surrounding woods. A strange, unnatural silence hung in the air, unbroken by the sound of birds or insects. The trees were twisted into strange shapes, their growth stunted, their bark covered in a sickly, pale moss. It was a landscape that felt deeply, fundamentally unwell. Silas Croft, a man who had never been afraid in the woods, stayed close to the others, his hand rarely leaving the hunting knife on his belt. Using the partial coordinates from the scientist's logbook and Croft's intimate knowledge of the terrain, they found the location described as Site B. It was a shallow, marshy clearing, a natural basin in the landscape. To the untrained eye, it looked like any other part of the forest. But Finch's historical senses and Chen's geological expertise told them otherwise. The ground was unnaturally flat in places, the soil composition was different, and the trees at the edge of the clearing all seemed to lean away from it, as if recoiling from something in the earth. David Chen set up his equipment, a portable ground-penetrating radar, GPR unit, and a highly sensitive magnetometer. As he powered on the devices, a low hum filled the clearing, a strange technological sound in the ancient silence. He began to walk a careful grid pattern across the clearing, his eyes fixed on the laptop screen that displayed the data in real time. For the first hour, the readings showed nothing but bedrock and tree roots. Finch felt a knot of anxiety tighten in his stomach. Had they been wrong? Then Chen stopped. He stared at the screen, his face pale. "Alistair," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "you need to see this." On the screen, a series of sharp geometric shapes appeared in the GPR data, anomalies buried about 10 feet beneath the surface. They were long, cylindrical objects, consistent in size and shape with the capsule Croft had found. The magnetometer confirmed the readings, showing strong metallic signatures from the same locations. They had found them, the missing capsules. But that was not the most shocking discovery. As Chen continued his scan, a different set of shapes began to appear on the screen, interspersed between the metallic cylinders. These shapes were softer, less defined, but their outlines were unmistakable. They were organic. They were the size and shape of human bodies. The GPR was detecting the disturbed soil and different density of skeletal remains. There were at least 3 of them, laid out in a row, buried at the same depth as the capsules. The clearing was not just a disposal site for hazardous materials, it was a grave, an unmarked, unsanctified, secret grave. The pieces of the puzzle clicked into place with horrifying clarity. The missing hikers from 1953, the logbook's panicked final entry about a containment failure. The scientists had not just abandoned their experiment, they had buried their victims. Whether these people were hikers who had stumbled upon the secret test, or perhaps even members of the project team who were exposed in the accident, the result was the same. They had been erased, their bodies hidden alongside the toxic evidence of the crime. This was the shocking truth behind the old mansion story replayed in the heart of a forest. The 3 men stood in the silent clearing, the weight of the discovery pressing down on them. The low hum of the GPR unit was the only sound. They were standing on a tomb, a secret cemetery created to protect a government secret. This discovery was the turning point. It elevated the story from one of corporate malfeasance and environmental negligence to one of homicide. The secret of Project Hemlock was not just that people had died because of it, it was that their deaths had been actively, criminally concealed. Finch knew with absolute certainty that he had crossed a threshold. There was no going back. This was no longer an academic inquiry. It was a murder investigation. He had irrefutable physical evidence of a crime that had been hidden for over 30 years. The question now was what he would do with it. To expose it would be to invite the full, crushing weight of the powers that had created this secret in the first place. To keep it hidden would be to become an accomplice to the crime. The forest held its breath, waiting for his decision. The underground secret was out. The discovery at Site B forced Dr. Finch's hand. He knew that the evidence from the ground-penetrating radar was too explosive to be handled through conventional channels. The local sheriff would bury it, and the university would disavow it. He made a calculated decision to leak the information, to bring the secret to light in a way that could not be easily suppressed. He anonymously sent copies of the GPR scans, along with a summary of his research and excerpts from the logbook, to a trusted investigative journalist at the Oregonian, the state's largest newspaper. The response was not what he had anticipated. Instead of a front-page exposé, there was silence. Days turned into a week, and the newspaper printed nothing. When Finch, using a pseudonym, called the journalist to inquire, he was met with a curt, evasive response. The journalist claimed his editor had killed the story, citing a lack of official confirmation and the sensitive nature of the allegations. It was a classic case of institutional cold feet, but Finch suspected something more. The story had been silenced not by journalistic skepticism, but by external pressure. The official response, when it came, was swift and decisive. 2 days after his call to the newspaper, Finch was visited at his university office. They were not local law enforcement. They were 2 men in dark, conservative suits, their faces impassive, their presence radiating an aura of quiet federal authority. They did not introduce themselves by name, only by agency, the Department of Energy, the modern successor to the Atomic Energy Commission. They were the inheritors of the secret. Their approach was not one of overt intimidation, but of smooth, bureaucratic suffocation. They did not deny the existence of Project Hemlock. In fact, they confirmed it, speaking of it in vague terms as a Cold War-era materials survey of no particular significance. They calmly informed Finch that all records pertaining to the project and any similar projects from that era were classified at the highest level for reasons of national security. They were not there to threaten him. They were there to inform him of the law. They strongly advised him to cease his research immediately. They explained that his continued investigation into a classified matter could be construed as a violation of the Espionage Act. They informed him that his access to all federal and state archives was being indefinitely suspended pending a security review. In the space of 15 minutes, they had professionally and legally cut him off from his life's work. They were not erasing the secret. They were building a wall of bureaucratic steel around it. This was not a simple case of a hidden room, but a systematic burial of history. The men also addressed the GPR scans. They claimed the anomalies were geological formations or buried refuse from old logging operations, and that his interpretation was highly speculative and irresponsible. They informed him that the U.S. Forest Service would be permanently closing the area he had visited, citing soil instability and environmental concerns. They were co-opting his own evidence, twisting the truth of the contamination into a pretext to seal off the crime scene forever. After they left, Finch sat in the silence of his office, a profound sense of cold dread creeping over him. He had underestimated the power and persistence of the secret. It was not a forgotten relic of the past. It was a living, breathing entity, an institutional memory that had its own defense mechanisms. The system he had tried to expose had turned its immense impersonal power against him. He was no longer just an academic researcher, he was now an enemy of the state. The silence that followed was more unnerving than the visit itself. The journalist at the Oregonian stopped returning his calls. His colleagues at the university began to avoid him, their conversations becoming strained and brief. He received a formal letter from the university administration, placing him on indefinite academic leave, to allow him to focus on his personal research projects. He was being professionally and socially isolated, cut adrift from the institutions that had defined his life. The obstruction was total. They had not come for his evidence. They did not need to. They had simply made it impossible for him to use it. They had discredited him, isolated him, and legally barred him from continuing his work. They had buried the story of Project Hemlock for a second time, this time under a mountain of red tape and implied threats. The silence that descended was the sound of a secret being successfully kept, the sound of history being held captive. The secret tunnel to the past had been sealed. The wall of institutional silence seemed impenetrable. Doctor. Finch was isolated, his career in ruins, his evidence effectively neutralized. The story of Project Hemlock appeared to be destined for a second, more permanent burial. He fell into a state of deep despondency, the weight of the secret he carried becoming an almost physical burden. The truth was in his possession, but he was a messenger with no one to deliver his message to. The world had chosen not to listen. It was in this moment of despair that a new voice emerged from the past. The voice belonged to Eleanor Vance. She was the elderly woman who had made the first anonymous phone call, the daughter of Dr. Robert Vance, one of the lead scientists on Project Hemlock. Having seen the official denial and the sudden silencing of the story, she made the courageous decision to step out of the shadows. She contacted Finch directly, arranging a clandestine meeting in a quiet corner of a public library in a town miles away from Astoria. She was a small, frail woman in her late 70s, but her eyes burned with a fierce, long-suppressed intensity. She came bearing a gift, a final inheritance from her father. It was a small steel footlocker, rusted at the hinges, which her father had kept hidden in the attic of his home until his death. He had made her promise to never open it unless the Hemlock secret ever threatened to surface. He had told her it was his atonement. Inside the footlocker was a collection of documents that Robert Vance had secretly smuggled out of the project when it was shut down. It was his personal, unsanctioned archive of the crime. This was the hidden message that changed a forgotten story forever. The contents of the footlocker were a historian's dream and a moral nightmare. There were original unredacted copies of the project's scientific logs, which were far more detailed and damning than the single logbook Finch had found in the capsule. They contained the names of all personnel involved, the exact chemical composition of the radioisotope, and a detailed record of the accident, including the precise levels of radiation released. The documents confirmed that the plume of contamination had been far larger than even Finch had suspected, drifting over populated areas for 2 full days before the wind shifted. But the most damning evidence was a set of private medical files. Dr. Vance, a biochemist, had been secretly tasked with monitoring the health of the project's own personnel. The files were a grim record of the effects of acute radiation exposure on the project's own soldiers and scientists. They detailed the rapid onset of sickness, the failed attempts at treatment, and the quiet unrecorded deaths of at least 2 low-ranking military personnel. These men were not listed as casualties of the project. Their deaths had been attributed to sudden illness or training accidents. And then there was the map. It was a hand-drawn, meticulously detailed map of the quarantine zone created by Dr. Vance himself. It showed the location of Site B, which was labeled not as a disposal site, but as the quarantine burial zone. Notes in the margin detailed the exact contents of each buried capsule, but most chillingly, the map showed the locations of the 3 bodies Finch's GPR had detected. Next to them were names, the names of the 3 missing hikers from the 1953 newspaper articles. A final scribbled note read, "Civilian casualties, accidental exposure, no witnesses, order from command, sanitize." The evidence was irrefutable and utterly horrifying. The hikers had stumbled into the disaster zone during the containment failure. They had been exposed to lethal doses of radiation, and the project's leadership, under orders from a nameless command authority, had not rescued them or offered medical aid. They had contained them. They had waited for them to die, and then they had buried their bodies alongside the toxic waste to erase the only witnesses to their crime. It was not just a cover-up. It was a state-sanctioned murder. Eleanor Vance also gave Finch her father's private journal. The journal was a portrait of a man's descent into a personal hell. It chronicled his scientific excitement at the start of the project, his growing horror at the risks they were taking, his panic during the accident, and his profound, soul-crushing guilt over the cover-up. He wrote of the nightmares that haunted him for the rest of his life, of seeing the faces of the hikers in his dreams. His final entry, written just before his death from cancer, was a single, desperate plea. Let the forest tell the story. The earth does not lie. With this new, unimpeachable evidence, the wall of silence was breached. Finch now had names, dates, direct orders, and a first-hand account from a scientist at the heart of the conspiracy. He had the complete, unredacted story of Project Hemlock, a story of hubris, disaster, murder, and a 30-year cover-up. The evidence that had resurfaced from the shadows was no longer something that could be dismissed or rationalized. It was the complete, horrifying truth, and it demanded a reckoning. The creepy story of the locked room had been opened, and its contents were about to be exposed to the world. The documents from Dr. Vance's footlocker did more than just provide factual evidence. They offered a chilling window into the psychological collapse of the men who perpetrated the cover-up. Robert Vance's journal was a study in moral decay, the chronicle of a good man forced to participate in an unforgivable act, and the lifelong burden of guilt that followed. He described a state of near mutiny among the lower-ranking scientists and soldiers in the days following the accident, a breakdown of the chain of command as the reality of the disaster set in. The journal detailed a climate of extreme paranoia and fear. The project leaders, operating under direct classified orders from a command structure Vance never identified, locked down the entire site. Communication with the outside world was cut off. The men were told that any breach of secrecy would be treated as an act of treason. They were trapped in the poisoned forest, with the consequences of their actions, a small, isolated society rapidly succumbing to fear and distrust. The journal was a record of a collective psychological breakdown. Vance described the discovery of the 3 hikers with harrowing detail. They had been found near the edge of the contamination zone, already suffering from severe radiation sickness. The project's medic had confirmed their exposure was lethal. The order that came down from command was cold and pragmatic. The hikers were now a security risk. They could not be allowed to leave the site and tell their story. They were to be quarantined and observed. Vance understood this was a death sentence. He wrote of the men's pleas for help and the silent armed guards who kept them confined to a makeshift medical tent. The psychological toll on the project staff was immense. Vance described scientists weeping in their bunks at night, soldiers drinking heavily, and a pervasive sense of dread that hung over the camp. They were all accomplices now, witnesses to a slow, deliberate murder. The official narrative they were ordered to uphold, that this was a minor, contained incident, was a lie so profound that it began to fracture their sense of reality. They were living inside the cover-up, and it was poisoning them as surely as the radiation. The journal also revealed the source of the project's name. Hemlock was not just a code word, it was a grim literary allusion. The project's civilian director was a classicist who saw their work as a noble Socratic pursuit of knowledge for the state. But after the accident, the name took on a darker meaning. They had, like Socrates, been handed a cup of poison. Some, like the director, drank it willingly in the name of duty and national security. Others, like Vance, were forced to drink it, and it corroded their souls for the rest of their lives. This psychological breakdown was not confined to the past. As Dr. Finch began to share the new, more detailed evidence with the small group of victims' families who supported him, it triggered a new wave of collective trauma. The vague, suppressed grief they had lived with for decades was now given a name and a face. Their loved ones had not been the victims of a tragic accident or a mysterious illness. They had been casualties of a deliberate act of criminal negligence and concealment. The knowledge was both a relief and a profound violation. The community fracture deepened into a chasm. The publication of the new evidence in a series of articles by a small independent newspaper outside the state's media ecosystem ignited a firestorm. The official denials from the state and federal government became more strenuous, but they were now contradicted by photocopies of Vance's own logs and journal entries. The town was torn apart by lawsuits, public accusations, and bitter recriminations. The psychological breakdown of the Hemlock team was now being replayed on a societal scale 30 years later. Finch found himself at the center of this storm, no longer just a historian, but a custodian of a community's pain. He received death threats from those who believed he was destroying the town's reputation, and tearful calls of gratitude from those for whom he had finally provided answers. The weight of the story was immense, a psychological burden that mirrored the one Dr. Vance had carried. He was living with the ghosts of Project Hemlock, and he began to understand the true, lasting horror of the secret. It did not just kill people, it shattered the trust, the memory, and the very soul of a community. The final horrifying detail from Vance's journal was his description of the burial. After the last hiker died, the men were ordered to dig the graves at Site B at night, using only hand tools. They worked in silence, under the cold, indifferent light of the stars, burying the bodies alongside the toxic capsules. It was a profane, desperate act, a final attempt to impose order on a situation that had spiraled into chaos and horror. Vance wrote that the silence of the forest that night was the loudest sound he had ever heard. It was the sound of a crime being absorbed into the earth, a sound that had echoed in his memory until the day he died. The information from Dr. Vance's footlocker was the final piece of the puzzle, but Dr. Finch knew that to force a true reckoning, he needed something more. He needed evidence that was not historical, not a document that could be dismissed as a forgery, but something physical, present, and irrefutable. The graves at Site B were the heart of the matter. As long as they remained undisturbed, the official denials could continue. The story needed a body, a literal ghost to rise from the poisoned earth and speak the truth. This mystery story behind the coffin, found beneath the house, was now a quest for a coffin buried in the forest. Working with a small independent legal team funded by the victims' families, Finch filed a lawsuit against the federal government. The lawsuit did not ask for money. It asked for one thing, an exhumation order for Site B. The legal battle was long and arduous. The Department of Energy fought them at every turn, invoking national security, state secrets privilege, and every bureaucratic obstacle they could devise. They argued that the site was a known hazardous waste area, and that any disturbance would pose an unacceptable environmental risk. It was a cynical, ironic defense. They were using the very contamination they had denied to prevent the discovery of their crimes. But the weight of Vance's documents, the map, the medical files, the journal, was too great to be dismissed. After a year of legal wrangling, a federal judge in a landmark ruling granted a limited court-supervised archaeological excavation of Site B. It was a stunning victory, a moment when the slow, grinding machinery of justice had finally aligned with the truth. The order stipulated that the excavation would be conducted by a neutral third-party team of forensic archaeologists, with observers from both Finch's side and the government. The day of the excavation was a somber, surreal event. The remote clearing in the Siuslaw National Forest was transformed into a media circus and a hazmat zone. A perimeter was established, guarded by federal marshals. The archaeological team, dressed in full-body protective suits, worked under the glare of television cameras and the watchful eyes of government officials. The air was thick with a tension that was almost unbearable. This was a moment of national importance, a public confrontation between a hidden history and the official record. The team began by excavating the location of the first anomaly on the GPR scan, one of the sites marked on Vance's map, with the name of a missing hiker, John Creasel. They dug with painstaking care, removing the soil layer by layer. The Geiger counters they used chirped intermittently, a constant unnerving reminder of the invisible poison that saturated the earth. For hours, they found nothing but dirt, rocks, and roots. The government observers watched with smug, knowing looks, their expressions suggesting this was all a pointless, expensive charade. Then, at a depth of 10 feet, a shovel struck something that was not rock. The archaeologists cleared away the surrounding soil, revealing the corroded lead-grey surface of a metal cylinder. It was a hemlock capsule, identical to the one Silas Croft had found. The discovery sent a murmur through the assembled crowd of journalists and observers. The first part of the story was confirmed, but the real proof was yet to come. The team shifted their focus to a spot a few yards away, the location the GPR had identified as a human burial. They dug again, this time with even greater care. The silence in the clearing deepened, all eyes fixed on the growing pit in the earth. And then they found it. Not a coffin, but the tattered, preserved remnants of a wool hunting jacket. Beneath it, the unmistakable darkened outlines of a human skeleton, its bones stained by the mineral-rich soil. The forensic anthropologist knelt in the pit, his voice amplified by the speaker in his helmet. "We have human remains," he announced, his tone flat and professional. But the words landed like a thunderclap. The irrefutable discovery had been made. The ghost of John Kreisel had been found, exactly where Robert Vance's map said he would be. In the days that followed, the remains of the other two hikers were unearthed, along with 2 more hemlock capsules. The excavation had confirmed every detail of Finch's investigation. The secret grave in the heart of the forest was real. The government's 30-year-old lie had been dug up and exposed to the harsh light of day. This unbelievable discovery was now a matter of public record. The government observers, their faces grim and ashen, could no longer deny the truth. The evidence was there in the soil, in the bones, in the corroded metal of the capsules. The forest had finally told its story, and it was a story of murder. The discovery at Site B was the ultimate, undeniable fact, a piece of physical reality that no amount of bureaucratic obstruction or legal maneuvering could erase. Finch stood at the edge of the police tape, watching as the remains were carefully documented and prepared for removal. He felt no sense of triumph, only a profound, hollow sadness. He had won. He had unearthed the truth. But the victory felt like a wound. The bones in the pit were not just evidence. They were the remains of a man who had gone for a walk in the woods one day and had never come home. The horror of the story was no longer an academic concept. It was a tangible, human tragedy. The silence of the forest seemed to echo with the final, unheard cries of the men who had been buried there. The story was over, but the haunting would last forever. The exhumation at Site B triggered a political and media firestorm. The images of hazmat-suited archaeologists lifting human remains from the poisoned soil of a national forest were broadcast across the country. The story of Project Hemlock, once a fringe conspiracy theory, was now a national scandal. The federal government, faced with irrefutable evidence, could no longer maintain its wall of silence. The carefully constructed cover-up, which had held for over 3 decades, collapsed in a matter of days. The immediate response from Washington was a frantic exercise in damage control. The Department of Energy issued a carefully worded statement acknowledging the existence of a since-decommissioned Cold War-era research program and expressed deep regret for the unfortunate procedural errors that led to the improper disposal of materials and the tragic loss of life. The language was a masterpiece of bureaucratic euphemism, an apology that admitted nothing of substance. They called it a tragedy, not a crime, an error, not a cover-up. A congressional investigation was launched, a piece of political theater designed to give the appearance of accountability. The hearings were televised, featuring a parade of aging, tight-lipped bureaucrats and retired military officials who answered questions with carefully rehearsed evasions and claims of faded memory. The key figures who had given the orders were either dead or too infirm to testify. The investigation concluded by blaming a systemic lack of oversight and a culture of secrecy inherent to the Cold War, effectively holding no single individual accountable. In the small towns bordering the Siuslaw National Forest, the aftermath was more personal and chaotic. The confirmation of the story brought not closure, but a new kind of pain. The families of the dead hikers were finally given remains to bury, but they were also forced to confront the horrifying truth of how their loved ones had died. The community was deluged by lawyers and activists, turning their private grief into a public cause. Lawsuits were filed, but most were settled out of court for undisclosed sums. the agreements containing strict confidentiality clauses that legally reburied the story. The government's official response to the contaminated land was to declare the entire 5-square-mile area a permanent federal exclusion zone, a national sacrifice zone. It was fenced off with high-security wiring and dotted with ominous yellow and black radiation warning signs. The area was deemed too hazardous to ever fully decontaminate. The government's final act was to turn the crime scene into a permanent monument to its own crime, a piece of the American landscape that was now officially and forever poisoned. The story of this abandoned place was now enshrined in federal law. Dr. Alistair Finch, the man who had brought the story to light, found himself adrift in the storm he had created. He was hailed as a hero by some and condemned as a traitor by others. He was a central witness in the congressional hearings, where his meticulous research was entered into the official record. But he found the process deeply unsatisfying. He saw how the complex human tragedy of his investigation was being flattened into a political narrative, its sharp edges smoothed over for public consumption. He retreated from the public eye, refusing interviews and returning to his quiet, solitary life. He had succeeded in his quest to uncover the truth, but he found that the truth itself was not enough. The systems of power he had challenged had not been defeated. They had simply absorbed the blow, adapted their narrative, and moved on. The story of Project Hemlock had been exposed, but the deeper, more insidious culture of secrecy that had created it remained untouched. The most chilling part of the aftermath was the silence that followed the storm. Once the congressional hearings were over and the lawsuits settled, the media moved on to the next scandal. The national attention faded. The story of Project Hemlock, once a front-page headline, began its slow slide back into obscurity, destined to become a historical footnote, a case study for academics like himself. The machine had processed the anomaly and restored its equilibrium. Finch realized the fatalistic truth at the heart of his discovery. He had not slain a monster. He had merely forced it to show its face for a fleeting moment. The forces that had buried the secret of Project Hemlock were not a cabal of evil men, but the impersonal, self-perpetuating machinery of the modern state, an entity for which secrecy and self-preservation were paramount. The immediate aftermath was not a victory for truth, but a demonstration of how even the most horrifying truths can be managed, packaged, and ultimately absorbed by the very systems that created them. The silence that returned to the forest felt heavier than before, filled with the weight of a story told but not truly heard. In the years and decades that followed the exhumation, the story of Project Hemlock slowly receded from the headlines and began its transformation into history. The official documented legacy of the event was a sterile and carefully managed narrative, one that acknowledged the facts while stripping them of their moral horror. The final report of the congressional investigation became the definitive official account, a dense 1,000-page document that was technically public but practically inaccessible, buried in the depths of the government publishing office. The report concluded that Project Hemlock was a product of the unique pressures of the Cold War, a regrettable but perhaps necessary evil in the existential struggle against the Soviet Union. It used the passive voice to describe the deaths of the hikers, stating that errors in judgment were made and protocols were not followed. The report's final recommendation was for improved oversight of classified research, a bureaucratic solution to a crime of profound moral failure. The institutional memory had been sanitized, the story absorbed into the bland, amoral language of government reports. The legacy in the scientific community was equally muted. A few academic papers were published in obscure journals, analyzing the environmental persistence of the radioisotope released by the project. The papers were highly technical, focusing on half-life and soil chemistry, never mentioning the human cost. Project Hemlock became a data point, its name a footnote in studies of radiological contamination. The scientific establishment, like the government, had found a way to document the event without acknowledging its full, terrifying implications. The real story was buried again, this time in jargon. In Clatsop County, the legacy was more tangible and persistent. The permanent exclusion zone, the sacrifice zone, became a dark feature of the local geography. It was a place of legends and rumors, a blank spot on the map that locals warned their children to stay away from. It became known as the Poison Woods or Hemlock Forest, a piece of local folklore. The story survived not as a documented historical event, but as a creepy, cautionary tale whispered around campfires, a ranger story that had become a ghost story. The long-term health consequences continued to manifest. Epidemiological studies conducted by independent researchers and funded by the victims' families continued to show elevated rates of cancer and autoimmune diseases in the communities downwind and downstream from the site. These studies were published, but were officially dismissed by state and federal health agencies as inconclusive or statistically insignificant. The documented legacy of the poisoning was a quiet, ongoing pattern of sickness, a tragedy that continued to unfold in the sterile language of medical statistics. Dr. Alistair Finch's own legacy was a complicated one. He published a single definitive book on the subject, a meticulously researched and passionately argued account, titled Project Hemlock: Anatomy of a Secret. The book was critically acclaimed in small academic circles, but was largely ignored by the mainstream press. It was a commercial failure. The public, it seemed, had a limited appetite for such a dark and unresolved story. Finch never achieved the widespread recognition he deserved. He finished his career in the same quiet, cluttered office, a man who had told the truth but had not been able to make the world truly listen. The most poignant part of the documented legacy was found in the Clatsop County Historical Society, the same institution that had once tried to silence Finch. In their archives, they now have a small permanent exhibit on Project Hemlock. It features a replica of the capsule, photos of the excavation, and a brief neutral text describing the events. It frames the story as a unique, tragic chapter in local history, a dark time that the community has since overcome. The exhibit is a final, subtle act of narrative containment, turning a story of profound national crime into a quaint local tragedy. The story, in the end, was not erased. It was documented, archived, and memorialized. But this documentation was itself a form of forgetting. By turning the event into a historical tragedy, the institutions that documented it stripped it of its present-day urgency. They placed it safely in the past, a closed chapter that no longer had any bearing on the present. The documented legacy of Project Hemlock is the ultimate proof of the system's resilience. It shows how even the most horrifying secrets, once exposed, can be managed, historicized, and ultimately defanged. The truth is on display, but it is no longer dangerous. In the end, the forest was the only witness that did not compromise. The permanent fence around the 5-square-mile exclusion zone stands as a stark, silent monument to the truth. Inside its perimeter, nature has begun the slow, indifferent process of reclamation. Young, healthy-looking trees now grow over the unmarked graves and the buried capsules, their roots slowly intertwining with the leaden cylinders and the bones of the men they killed. The forest is healing itself on the surface, covering the scars of history with a blanket of green, but the poison remains in the soil, in the water, a permanent, invisible legacy that will persist for centuries. The land itself remembers, even if the people have chosen to forget. Dr. Alistair Finch lived out the rest of his years in quiet obscurity, a custodian of a truth that was too large and too terrible for the world to fully embrace. He kept the original documents from Robert Vance's footlocker locked in a fireproof safe in his home, a private archive of the crime. He knew that the official records, the congressional reports, and the museum exhibits were all just sanitized echoes of the real story. He held the primary evidence, the horrified human voice of the men who had been there. It was a burden he carried until his death. Sometimes late at night he would see it, a nondescript sedan parked at the end of his quiet suburban street, its engine off, its interior dark. It would stay for an hour, sometimes 2, and then disappear as silently as it had arrived. There were no threats, no confrontations, just the quiet, persistent reminder that he was being watched. It was the system's final, subtle message. The secret had been exposed, but the keepers of secrets were eternal. They had not forgotten him. They were simply waiting. The legacy of Project Hemlock was not just a poisoned forest, but a life lived under a permanent, invisible shadow. The story leaves behind a series of heavy, unresolved questions. How many other hemlocks are there? How many other secret histories lie buried in the forgotten corners of the landscape, waiting for an accidental discovery to bring them to light? The tale of the lumberjack and the hidden capsule is not just a story about the past. It is a fatalistic parable about the nature of power and the resilience of secrecy. It suggests that for every truth that is uncovered, countless others remain buried, locked away in the earth, in the archives, and in the silent, complicit memory of institutions. The final, chilling thought is that the system never truly fails. It adapts, absorbs, and endures. The exposure of Project Hemlock did not lead to a fundamental change, only to a refinement of the methods of concealment. The next secret will be buried deeper, the cover story will be more sophisticated, and the walls of silence will be built higher. The story is a loop, a cycle of discovery and suppression that is destined to repeat itself. The forest is vast, and it holds many secrets. What Silas Croft found in the heart of that ancient tree was more than a metal capsule. It was the core of a truth that is both terrifying and timeless, that the quietest places can hold the loudest secrets, and that history is not a settled, comfortable thing, but a contested, dangerous ground. The ghosts of Project Hemlock do not rest in the soil of the Siuslaw National Forest. They linger in the unanswered questions, in the redacted files, and in the profound, unsettling silence that follows a story that has been told but never truly finished. The forest waits and it remembers. If you want to uncover more mysteries like this one, subscribe to the channel and never miss the real stories that history tried to bury. Leave a comment with where you're watching from, and share this story so the truth is never forgotten.